access to. Religious scholar Karen Armstrong is already familiar to many Unitarian Universalists for her finely researched and engaging books such as The Battle for God, a survey of fundamentalism within Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. With an unusual opportunity from TED, TED, a global network of creative thinkers committed to improving our world, Armstrong is promoting a movement that she hopes will help to transform the human condition. She was also the speaker, as Madonna said, at the prestigious Ware Lecture at our annual General Assembly in Charlotte, North Carolina this past summer, with several thousand Unitarian Universalists in attendance. As Madonna also said, I know that you're going to be viewing her video next week, and I highly recommend that you make time to see and discuss why we were so enthusiastic about her response to this particular spiritual challenge. Armstrong was raised in an Irish family living in England, entered a convent at the age of 17, and became a nun. After several very unhappy years trying to reconcile her love of learning with her religious order's demand for obedience, she left professional religious life to become a teacher. She was later contracted to write a television documentary about the life of the Christian leader Paul, traveled to the Middle East, and became fascinated with the beauty and the history and the interrelatedness of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This and other experiences as a scholar and writer rekindled her passion in the world's religions, but this time, like many of us, as someone who thinks of herself as spiritual rather than religious in the formal sense. Perhaps it's this reason that her writing so skillfully balances a fascination with the religious impulse without needing to defend any one tradition as the only right answer. When she first began to study seriously the different religious traditions, Armstrong was surprised to recognize that the emphasis that we see today on conforming with rigid dogma was really a preoccupation only here in the Western world, and only very recently at that. For example, she explains that the Quran dismisses this obsession with doctrine as, quote, self-indulgent guesswork that makes people quarrelsome and stupidly sectarian. And she notes that in 17th century Europe, the word belief still reflected its shared roots with beloved. It still meant to cherish or to hold dear. In a similar manner, the word credo had not yet gained its dogmatic overtones, but expressed the roots that it shares with cardio, in the sense of setting one's heart upon some cherished value. I know from my own research that by the 19th century, the meaning of the words credo and belief had undergone a profound shift from that stance of heartfelt trust in the world to an intellectual agreement with a theological doctrine. Armstrong's research has uncovered the shared historical heart of the world's great religions. At the core of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions, she says, lies the principle of compassion, calling us to treat all others as we would wish to be treated. In each of the world's major religions, Armstrong has noted the same commands to cultivate a relationship with the world in which we feel with others, finding joy in their joy, feeling pain in their pain. Whatever their particular image of God or of the religious life, each of the world's religious movements has taught that it is through compassion that we truly experience the presence of the divine. In particular, the ethic of compassion in each of these religions is expressed in the form commonly called the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. And this rule has a long, long history. Armstrong tells the story of a pagan who came to visit the Rabbi Hillel, who lived in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. The pagan offered to convert to Judaism if Hillel could recite the whole of Jewish teaching while standing on one leg. These are the things that get asked of ministers once in a while. Hillel stood on one leg and said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." The rest of the Torah is commentary. Now go and study it. Not only was compassion prominently expressed in the religious scriptures, but the Rabbi Meir, who lived 2 centuries after Hillel, asserted that any reading of these holy texts that leads us to hatred or disdain of any other people is an illegitimate interpretation. Even in those ancient times when the world's religions were still being established, we were already worrying about our temptation to fall into disconnection and the neglect of one another, and the ease with which we could allow our most vulnerable to fall through the cracks. The religious ethic of compassion was developed with the intention of requiring deep connections with others, even with those whose lives seemed so different from our own. Given this historical knowledge, it's not surprising that Armstrong considers modern dogmatism as the illegitimate hijacking of religion. And she condemns the use of religious language to justify horrible thoughts and deeds. On her global travels, she regularly meets people who single out religion as the primary cause of the world's problems. And she's quick to correct them that these conflicts have usually been fought over political ambition, greed, and envy, and are given a veneer of religious language to sanitize their true motives. She points out that one of the factors contributing to these conflicts, disguised as religious, is the widespread existence of a particular kind of religious illiteracy, in which the ethical life is replaced with an emphasis on having the right belief, concern for being right over being compassionate. As pervasive as this abuse of religious ideals seems, Armstrong reports that she's also seeing on her global travels that many people share her desire to change this situation. She's commonly asked what ordinary people can do to tip the world's responses back in the direction of compassion, to help make it possible again for religion to serve the cause of harmony rather than division. Every year, the TED network of conferences awards one innovator a prize of $100,000, as well as the use of all its resources and its enormous community to grant them one wish to change the world for the better. Armstrong was awarded a TED Prize in 2008, and she used her opportunity to publicize the Charter for Compassion, a statement of universal justice and respect written collaboratively by the leading inspirational thinkers in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. The TED Network has developed videos, websites, and workshops to promote this manifesto and the role of religion as one important voice of compassion. Armstrong speaks of this project with great urgency, as you'll see in the video next week. She believes that if we do not seriously address the barriers to living as a peaceful global society, there may not be a civilization to hand down to the future generations. And she's explicitly not talking about a cartoonish spirit of love wafting over us and magically transforming our conflicted world. She describes this task as a movement that will not happen if we do not make it happen. The Charter recognizes that the principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions. It calls us to avoid, both in private and publicly, inflicting pain on others, even our enemies, in thought, word, and deed. Although each of us has fallen short of this goal at times, we are invited to join with other seekers everywhere to restore compassion to the center of what it means to be moral and what it means to be religious. For we acknowledge that it is essential to our own wholeness and illumination, and to the possibility of a world made whole again through justice and peace. If we are to take the issue of compassion seriously, however, we also need to take seriously the objections to Armstrong's project. One common criticism is that the promotion of compassion seems to suggest that we must tolerate unkindness and remain silent in the face of injustice. My colleague, the Reverend Dottie Matthews, over in Appleton, wisely notes that the Golden Rule does not call us to treat others as we have been treated. This eye for an eye ethic is an acceptance of an unhealthy model of relationship in which we may treat others unkindly if we have a good enough excuse. Martin Luther King observed in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that we must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. We do not doubt Dr. King's rejection of racism and his commitment to justice, and yet he calls us to insist on a stance toward the world which is committed to healing rather than retaliation. Well, what about practical objections then? That it's just not realistic to think that we can extend compassion to people who are unkind to us. Certainly there are those to whom we can realistically offer compassion, but isn't it really self-defense to lash out at the Tea Partiers or the racists or whoever else is contributing to mean-spiritedness in the world? Armstrong isn't promising us that it will be easy, just that it's vitally important. She acknowledges how, for many of us, it is much more appealing to be right than to be kind. And it's clear that the long-ago prophets of the world's religions understood this inclination. As their tribes and clans conflicted with one another with increasing frequency, their prophets were explicit that this vision would not work if we only extended compassion to people who were just like us. Armstrong urges in her spiritual biography, The Spiral Staircase, you must not practice the spirituality of empathy simply in order to get something for yourself. You have to be prepared to extend your compassionate interest even when there is no hope of return. Another concern about Armstrong's project arises in the ease with which we confuse other states with compassion. Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron explains that every spiritual value has competing values that she calls the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy of a virtue is something that masquerades as that value and distracts us from pursuing it in its real form. One near enemy of compassion is pity, treating those who suffer as poor unfortunate, people whose lives are completely disconnected from our own, but whom we might rescue with a noble act of generosity on our part. Another near enemy of compassion is the sickly sweet niceness that reassures us that we are good people, but absolves us of any obligation to go any deeper. In neither of these near enemies do we ever actually open our hearts and feel with others. We only play act as if we do. The far enemy of compassion is its true opposite. Not so much cruelty or malice, because again, this implies that compassion is merely niceness. I believe that the true opposite to compassion is, in fact, indifference. Neglect not only toward individuals, but toward all of life in general. The pursuit of genuine compassion means avoiding both kinds of these pitfalls. Lastly, I want to address the objection that maybe Armstrong is painting too rosy a picture about religion and compassion. Colleagues of mine have pointed out that religious people are not always compassionate, and that leaders have long used religious language to justify our hurtful treatment of others. This raises for me the larger question of the misuse of religious values. And I have to acknowledge the ways in which I've seen the values of Unitarian Universalism used to justify our radical separation from one another, to rationalize our class privilege and our sense of entitlement, and to reduce the whole of religious experience to the level of a sterile intellectualism. I feel clear that these things are not what Unitarian Universalism is about, but I also have to admit that if the reality of religion is how we actually practice it, then the Unitarian Universalist practice is inescapably human and fallible. We will fall short again and again in our practice of compassion. We will struggle profoundly with it if we take it at all seriously. And hardest of all, we will call ourselves to return again and again to the task of this work after falling short each time. What Armstrong is calling us to consider is not a mere cosmetic change to our lives, but a fundamental transformation in our relationship with the world. And after a lifetime of learning one set of behaviors, we're going to need a lifetime of striving to be able to develop another set of responses. The goal is not to think of compassion as our daily good deed, a moment of niceness accomplished so we can check it off the list and return to our habitual disconnectedness. Rather, the constant practice of the golden rule reshapes us into a new relationship with the world and with ourselves. I call this a spiritual practice because I have to practice it every day, and I am constantly falling short of who I want to be as a seeker and a person of faith. But I also want not to ever give up on that vision. Armstrong reassures us that this compassion is a lifelong project. It is not achieved in an hour or a day. It is a struggle that will last until our dying hour. Therefore, this is the beginning of what I hope will be a longer conversation for you. I hope that you'll be here next week to view and discuss Armstrong's video and to talk about how we might work together as a community to develop compassion to be a spiritual reality rather than a vision. I believe that there's no better cause for which we could pour out our lives in the service of goodness. So let us begin together. May it be so. And I'd like to invite you now into a time of dialogue. If you have questions or comments that you would like